Okay, so the last time we left off and we were talking about Kiev and Rus, and now I'm going to continue today talking about Kiev and Rus. Here's a map of Kiev, probably in the early century, in the middle of the 11th century. And so last time we started talking about the Varangians and how they got there. And let me start with one of the takeaway points that I want you to come away with from this class today. So we're going to talk about the Rurikid dynasty, that their founding. As far as we know, the primary chronicle tells us 862 is the year when Rurik is invited to lead the Slavic peoples. I'll talk to you about the Normanist controversy of the 18th century. And then we'll talk about the Christianization of Rus. And last time you even read a bit of that story of the Christianization of Rus during our kind of activity time together. And so we'll talk about that. Going over, I did talk with you about the Moravian mission, Georgian a little bit. And then the last part of today is talking about this relationship between Kiev and Muscovy. And so we'll come up and think about how this history connects to contemporary politics and the message that Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin in Moscow sends. One second. All right. So first, and just to recover a little bit, we talked about those Varangians, these Vikings that come down, that the primary chronicle, the Povest Vremennych Liet, it was compiled in Kiev, recopied in the early 1100s. And I showed you some pictures, I'll show you again. And it's from here, this word Rus comes from the word Hros, like R-H-O-S, and it has various variations. One thing in super duper old documents, I'm not a linguist. I never get too hung up on spelling because I'll see the same word spelled different ways on the very same piece of paper. Very confusing. But anyway, this word Rus has Scandinavian origins. And according to the most prevalent theory, this word Rus is derived from an Old Norse term meaning the men who row, as rowing was the main method by which these peoples navigated the rivers. And one historian, Amelian Pritsak, he called Vikings the nomads of the sea. So I find that it's mildly ironic that from an 18th century perspective, Tsar Peter, to move ahead, he really lamented Russia's lack of a navy. And when Peter came to be Tsar, Russians actually had a reputation for not loving land. They do all kinds of trade, but they do more trade over land than over the sea. And so I want to share with you this one funny moment that I once found is that in discussing, so they had a reputation for being landlubbers and not so much people of the sea. And even in one 16th century German, this guy named Peter Marburger, he went to Russia. He went, and then he composed, well, actually, I'm not sure he went to Russia. He composed, at any rate, a phrase book that someone going to Russia, like these are some basic phrases that you should know how to get around. A lot of these start getting printed off the printing presses of the early modern period. And Peter Marburger, and they're also, I mean, these phrases often have things like, where do I find a prostitute is a pretty typical phrase that is content in these books. But Peter Marburger thought in his book that if you really wanted to get on well with Russian, a good conversation breaker might be to say, I don't love the sea. If I'm on land, I don't need to worry about drowning, which I think says something that he thought that this was a phrase that a Russian merchant might relate to and might find really useful. So that tells us that this German had this sense that Russians are really people that don't like land. So it's a little bit ironic that this word Russian may derive from Rus, this Old Norse word meaning people who row. All right. And so it's these people who row that are at the founding of the Rurikid dynasty. It actually gets founded up in Novgorod and then comes to, and then the Kiev becomes the more major city, sort of the first city in this entity, this affiliation, loosely affiliated states, principalities of Kiev and Rus. So at any rate, though, I want to talk to you about the Normanist, what's known as the Normanist controversy. And the reason it's called the Normanist controversy and not the Varangian controversy, I'm not entirely sure, except that, well, the reason is that Vikings went by many different names: Viking, Norman, Varangian. They're all different names for Vikings. And in the 18th century, they were sort of associating them more with Normans. So picture yourself. It's St. Petersburg. You are in a lecture hall at the Russian Academy of Sciences. It is September 6th, 1749. And this guy right here, Gerhard Friedrich Müller, rises up to start delivering his anniversary speech. And he decided that the speech he was going to give on something he'd been researching was on the origins of Russians. That paper in Latin, and he's giving the paper in Latin, by the way, Origenis Gentes et Nominis Russorum. And his text was based on research that a group of German academicians had been doing, studying the primary chronicle mostly, and also some Byzantine sources from the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus. Now, Müller had developed this theory that the ancient state of Kievan, Rus, was founded by Norsemen or Varangians, Vikings. Müller is standing up in the room giving this speech, and he gets shouted down. An angry Russian stood up, Nikita Ivanovich Popov, got up and yelled, in Latin too, "Tu clarissime auctor nostrum genentium infamia ficus." Says, "You, famous scholar, dishonor our nation." That says the Russian patriot speaking in Latin. So he doesn't have to, so he can't finish his speech, and the matter goes straight to the top. Under the authority of Empress Elizaveta Petrovna, who ruled Russia from 1741 to 1762, a special committee was formed to determine if Müller's writings were harmful to the interests and glory of the Russian Empire. And under Lomonosov, who would go on to be one of Russia's very sparkling academics, and a university is now named after him, it was determined that Müller, yes, indeed, had that his research could be harmful to the nation. And he was encouraged to turn his attention back to Siberian history, which is kind of good for me because I've studied so much of it, but he totally didn't want to do that. As I said, this was 1749. Müller had already spent, as part of the second Great Kamchatka expedition, or the Kamchatka expedition, or the Great Northern expedition, it goes by different names, this decade-long expedition, 1733 to 1743, where Vitus Bering goes over to see if Asia and Europe are actually connected or not, and dies on an island just off the coast of Russia on the way back in 1741. At any rate, it's part of that expedition. And Gerhard Müller is the head of the humanities side of things. He hates being sent to Siberia. Pretty much it ends up being this huge promotional moment for some other young Russian graduate students that are like, I'll go. And Kresheninikov is like, please send me to Kamchatka. I'll explore the whole thing. And Müller is like, I don't want to go past Tobolsk, so I'm just going to hang out here. Sure, hurry on, keep good notes, tell me all about it. And meanwhile, Müller stays in like Tobolsk. He might go to Tomsk, writing notes back to St. Petersburg, asking if he can come home because his hemorrhoids are bothering him tons. So he doesn't want to, he totally doesn't want to go back to Siberia. He decides that he will give up researching the Varangian Norman foundations of Russian history and focus on Siberia. So that's a little bit about Gerhard Müller. Wait, I'll tell you one more story. I think this is fascinating. So it's said that as he's traipsing around Siberia, basically he's like, I want to create an archive to keep track of this history of how the Russian Empire settled Siberia. And so he would go around and he would say to the voyevoda, which is kind of one of these hard to translate terms, and we usually translate it as military governor, because there's definitely a security aspect of setting up empire in Siberia in the 17th century, but there's also this governing aspect. So we say military governor for voyevoda. At any rate, he goes around and he shows up in a town, and there's about 17 at the time, and says, all right, your scribes are going to work for me. They're going to copy all the pieces of paper you have. I'm going to truck them back to Siberia. We're making an archive. We got to record this important history of how we've made an empire. And according to the grandson of one Cossack who was part of these expeditions, some messenger goes ahead to the city of Tomsk, which is, well, I'll show you maps of Tomsk at some point. He goes ahead to the city of Tomsk and is like, this guy is coming, he's total pain in the butt. He's going to totally usurp your labor force for as long as he's here. What a hassle. And so the governor of Tomsk says, he's going to take all my labor force copying documents. Well, I know how to solve this problem. And he takes all the boxes of documents that had been collected and he throws them in the river. And he's like, that solved that problem. So that, and I was like, urban legend or true story. And I have, I traced that story down to like from the very early 19th century, which I think is plausible. If he's saying his grandfather's 50 years previous, at any rate. Okay, so that takes you a little bit, perhaps the history of Siberia is a bit richer for the absolute offense that Gerhard Müller wrought, starting to tell Russians that it was actually people of Viking descent that founded the dynasty that made the great Russian nation. I say that tongue in cheek, and that has to do with that legacies thing we'll get to. The Rurikid dynasty. Okay, so that that's what I wanted to say about that. But and the controversy, it rages for centuries. It's pretty decided now. There isn't nearly as much controversy. And sometimes when I think about it, I even wonder why there was so much controversy. I mean, even the earliest princes and names, they so clearly have Slavic names like Rogveld and Oskar, and that are really of Norse origin, before we start to see these names giving way to names that we very much recognize as Slavic type names. And I mean, you can even read these first pages and detect that yourself. I think that that's a powerful clue, although there's always questions about how to read things and whatnot. Maybe, it could have worked the other way too, but all right, at any rate. So the primary chronicle starts with these Varangians coming in, and according to the story, the Slavic people that live around Novgorod, they go to these Vikings and they say, quote, "Our land is vast and abundant, but there is no order in it. Come and reign as princes and have authority over us." And you can see, so for Russian nationalists of the 18th century, that was an insulting implication, that Slavs would feel so ill-equipped to self-govern that they would ask someone to rule over them, and that was part of the objection. But so Rurik became the founder of a dynasty that we know as the Rurikid dynasty. And for all of Russian history, we have the Rurikid dynasty from 862 to 1598. And then we have this period of state interregnum, more or less. There are, the Goodenough dynasty. We have you might say Dmitry Shusky. Well, you'll know those names in just a couple of weeks. But then none of them really get established and have staying power. It's amidst civil war and foreign occupations, etc. So we really just say that there's two dynasties: the Rurikids, 862 to 1598, and then the Romanov dynasty, 1613 to 1917. So this question of who founds this original dynasty was a very important import. But moving on, I want to quote to you now from a historian of Central Eurasia, and who studied how nomads operated and that relationship between the forest and steppe that I spoke to you about last time. And I think one thing that Peter Golden wrote can maybe help us think about, so what was this Kievan state? What kind of government is it? Does it have an IRS? Of course, one of the things, I mean, at its most fundamental, what does a state do? A state amasses resources and redistributes them according to some sort of priorities. And I mean, if that means just going village to village, extorting stuff, and then just dividing the booty up among your buddies, in a very rudimentary way, is that a state? Or does a state have rule of law, big game changer, about how resources are redistributed in a state? At any rate, Peter Golden writes this about what this Kievan state by these Varangians might have looked at. He says, without venturing too deeply into the quagmire of the origins and formation of the Rus people and state, I think it has been reasonably well established that the early Rus, when they first appear in Western Eurasia, were a kind of polyethnic company of trader merchant mercenary groups, organized into a militarized trade diaspora, a trading military community of merchants living among alien peoples, that's his language, not mine, in associated networks found on every continent and back through time to the very beginnings of urban life. They, in time, would establish new bonds of solidarity between the diaspora traders and members of the host society. In the 9th century, they were probably not only the only such company operating in northwestern Eurasia, engaged in the gathering of furs and slaves for sale in Byzantium and the Islamic metropolises and the West. According to the 19th century Book of Roots and Kingdoms by an Iranian Muslim intelligence official, Ibn Khordadbeh, they largely supplanted another group that, according to Ibn Khordadbeh, the Radaniya was a Jewish trading diaspora similarly operating in the area. And so I read you that because if you were to hear Putin or any Russian tell this history, it's just a story of kind of the Varangians coming in and then gradually setting up shop and growing a state. And what Peter Golden is telling us is, no, you kind of have this militarized, maybe mafioso-like is a little bit uncharitable, but only a little bit, but these militarized trading diasporas that are working, trading, kind of extorting sometimes. They have military weapons. And if there's multiple of them simultaneously, then gradually kind of the Kievan princes rise to the top, so to speak, and are able to enforce more and enforce their own terms and maybe trace out, if not chase out other people, but kind of say, hey, we're the ones that get to collect taxes on this river road. And so we get to collect revenue from you that way because we built this bridge. And we're the ones that get to collect fur tribute from all the people that live in this village, right? That's sort of the most rudimentary way of what kind of government, if you will, looks like. And so it's a quite militarized operation. So if you think about them struggling with others, and then as I mentioned, if you think about the extent to which slave trading is part of the political economy of Eurasia. So nomads will swoop in and raid villages and take people and then sell them and down to the markets of Aleppo and to row the galleys across the Mediterranean for the Ottomans and things like that, and not just Ottomans. And so these Varangian princes that are setting up, they have a pretty militarized way of doing things. And one of the maybe services that they provide is sometimes, that they'll muster their army to protect against raids in the event that happens. Although, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't have the clearest of pictures on the timing of how all this works when you have like one moving retinue in villages and whatnot. But I think it helps explain why that might help explain why Kievan Rus gets set up as this place where there's all these different principalities. Oh goodness, did I, that the, oh, oh my goodness, of all the maps I have here today, I don't have quite the map that I want to show you, but I'll, okay, or here, this will do good enough. This, that if this is a map of Kievan Rus, you start to see around these towns, they start to be their own sort of principalities run by princes in this network. And in this network, let me just to say a little bit about this. In this network, they cooperate with each other. They understand themselves to derive from one political kind of tradition, but they also compete with each other to be in charge of, Gradually what happens is Kiev is determined to be the highest ranking city. And then there's these other cities. And what happens is, well, let me see, what happens is they rotate who goes where. Actually, let me continue on and tell this story of Christianity, and then we'll return to that story of kind of the politics of how Kievan Rus worked a little bit afterward. So the Christianization of Rus. Here, I'll just show you some slides. We talked last time about precursors to Christianity, was that in Eastern Europe, Georgia was very early on Christianized in the Caucasus Mountains with its own idiosyncratic almost brand of Christianity, as idiosyncratic as its language. And then as the Christianization of Eastern Europe emerges, there's a little bit of, there's a question and a tension. Will Eastern European places Christianize with the Latin way of doing things? I mean, will they ask the Pope in Rome to send them the books to run a mass, translations of the Bible, or will they appeal to Constantinople and have that mass? And the masses are becoming increasingly different, and and some of the beliefs are becoming increasingly different as well. Although in 988, when Vladimir converts, technically, it's just one church. But here you've read in this story of the Primary Chronicle, we read this story where he sends out his emissaries, and they go and they watch Muslims observing. They know something about Jews observing, and they decide that isn't the route for them. Why would we want to take a land of a people that have no homeland, is what the Chronicle tells you there. And then there's other versions that they don't eat pork, and so they're not going to, there's a lot of eating pork in this culture. So that was another thing that made it fit less. They go to Muslims and they say, well, there's no joy. They don't have that much joy, and they don't drink, and we need to drink. So those two are out. And then they go to these two different churches, right? So this is already a hint. Why are they calling them two different belief systems, even if they're still technically the same church? But at any rate, so they say, yeah, we went to the German church, and whatever, that seems okay. But then we went down to the church in Byzantium, and we attended mass, even in this very dome, St. Sophia. It was already built at the time. We attended the mass and we listened to the music, and we knew not whether we were on heaven and earth. And this kind of practice is the type, this is the worship we want to sign on to. And so goes the Chronicle, that thus Vladimir chose East Orthodox Christianity for his people. Now, I should say, he's not the first to be Christianized. His grandmother, Olga, she was a Christian. She even ruled a little bit as regent for her son, Sviatoslav, in the middle of the 10th century. She's his grandmother. She's mentioned in the primary chronicle, but in this crazy way. I didn't assign to you the story of Olga, but if you wanted to read this, let me know. There's some stories about her in this compilation of primary sources by Sergei Zenkovsky, Medieval Russia's Epics, Chronicles, and Tales. And so Olga's mentioned in the primary chronicle. Her conversion is mentioned. But there's also this story about her, the revenge on the Derevlinians, in the story of Igor's death and Olga's revenge. And basically, it's this story that has almost some pretty pagan and mythic or folkloric trappings to it. Maybe one of these moments where we should really remind us that even though the primary chronicle is like the only piece of paper that we have there. I mean, it's the oldest, earliest source. So historians rely on it so heavily, but we need to be reminded to not always just take it as straight up history of what happened, or just prepared to be really believed. So basically the story of Olga's revenge is that she's from one of these Slavic tribes, or one of these Slavic peoples, and that she is Slavic, marries someone, they have a son, Sviatoslav. She embraces Christianity. But her husband gets killed at some point. And in order to make revenge, she does a whole series of revenges, one of which includes having passenger pigeons with fire that are trained to fly into their enemies' homes without the matches going out, landing on their straw roofs and burning to the ground their whole place as one of her measures of revenge. Like, really hard to pull off. So there's this kind of folkloric element to her, but also she's this Christian grandmother. She supposedly travels to Constantinople as well. And there is in the primary Radziwill Chronicle, they record her Christianity. And so Vladimir isn't the very first person to Christianize on this territory, but his Christianization matters tremendously, because then he has his people en masse, which, as far as I know, I'd like to know more about this, is a pretty rare form of conversion. People generally convert one at a time, but Vladimir gets back, marches his people down to, he gets, in Kherson, he reportedly converts himself and then marches back to Kiev and has everyone march down to the river and be converted, some of them crying, wailing, gnashing of teeth. And so, here's a picture back to, I showed you, this is a pictures actually written into the text, illustrating Olga in Constantinople. And here's Vladimir receiving, I think here, the book of the word. This is the church, St. Sophia. Now was a mosque, then a museum, and just in the fall, just in recent weeks, the president Erdogan of Turkey reconverted it to use as a mosque, which some people have taken as a troubling move away from a secular society and more towards a religion-infused nationalist stance, a trend that has similarly been observed, that a move towards authoritarian trust plus an association of a secular state with a particular religion, kind of antithetical to the foundation of the United States of America. And we've seen it in other places. Some people were concerned when Mike Pence said, "I'm a Christian first and a public servant." I forget his exact language, second, but that sort of hierarchy from a public service was certainly at odds with that kind of secular foundation. And so similar, the move from museum back to mosque has been concerning for some, but others have celebrated the move as kind of a greater featuring of religion in life.
Dr. Manahan, I have a question. During this time period with the Christianization of Kiev, of the Kievan Rus, how did they respond to like the other like Christian religions, like or nations around them, especially like I think the Pope and the really like and the Catholic Church, as we kind of know as an establishment today, wasn't it really kind of established around that time period as well? So Do you know how they would have interacted with that?
With the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
Okay, so well, as the primary chronicle tells us, is so Vladimir he sees the Latin Christianity, or the Catholic Church, as one of his options, and he sees it as a better option than Judaism or Islam, but he decides that he wants to go with the Orthodox option over the Latin option, which in the chronicle text you read, it gets translated as the German option. Now, the reason that they give is because just the service was so inspiring. But as we're going to talk about, I'm going to suggest to you that it isn't just about the service, that there's also some politics at work here in why he chose Orthodoxy instead of Latin Christianity. That said, actually, if you wanted to know more about that, so we might ask that question, what's the relationship of Kievan Rus to the West in those centuries thereafter? This book right here documents that there's several marriages of Slavic princes to the West, to France, to, I think it's Yaroslavl's daughter or granddaughter marries King Harold of England in 1254. So yeah, it would have had to been, granddaughter a couple generations down. So some marriages are happening between people that have observed the Orthodox rite and the Catholic rite. But as and then we don't, except for these marriages that are documented in here, that history, even for me right now, is a little murkier until 1476, when the Grand Prince of Moscow is going to marry Sophia from Byzantium, even the niece of the Pope, or the Byzantine niece who's been residing in Rome in 1476. And that sort of opens up more connection of Russia interacting with the Latin Church. But I do think in the centuries that we're going to come into, the Mongol conquest kind of turns Russia's attention, or Rus's attention, to matters immediately to its east and south a little bit. So it's not really so concerned about the Pope. We'll talk more about that. And we'll kind of think about these religious fault lines. I want to be really careful. Even your question is a good one, because as I think about, the differences between that sort of interaction in the 1200s, 1300s versus in the 1500s when the Reformation has come around. Okay, but your question when you say about other religions generally reminds me of a really important point that I think I made quickly last time, but is worth being aware of. So we know that Vladimir, he's some sort of pagan worshiper. His grandmother embraced Christianity. He's not that committed. He sees religion as something that can have a unifying force on a people. And so for that reason, he is interested, it seems, in using religion to advance a sort of cohesiveness in this state that he's starting to have himself a sense that he's ruling over. And his first plan, because he recognizes that there's a lot of different religions and a lot of different gods that are ruled on his territory, from Zoroastrianism, fire worship, all kind of woods people, paganism, to different, some Christianity. And so he assembles on one of the hills in Kiev a pantheon with statues and monuments to various pagan gods. And one of them is Perun and some North gods and things like that. So he gives it a go at having some sort of religion. And then it maybe made sense, like, well, we get all these different people, different religions, let's have a sort of pantheon. But for some reason, he had a sense that didn't quite fly. And then he goes and converts to Christianity. So yeah, it's like probably in 980 that he establishes this pantheon. In 985, he goes and attacks the Bulgars, a Muslim entity. And so there, when we think about this story in the Chronicle, people ask, did it really happen like that? And I mean, it's a question. There have been some records found from from the second half of the 900s in some German courts of like Slavic emissaries coming. So maybe there's some kernel to it. Maybe it wasn't such a pat story. And that maybe it was in 985 that they had this interaction fighting a Muslim army and learn a little bit more about them. Of course, down in Constantinople, they've been fighting Muslim wars for a long time. And so they're really familiar with Muslims. If you'll recall from a Western Civ, maybe some of you, it was losing to Muslim armies that don't believe in having graven images. The Bible says that too, whatever, but that led some branches of Christianity to think, whoa, we've got to not have icons. No icons, that's a graven image. So, well, that didn't fly at all. Icons are hugely important part in the veneration of icons in both Western and Eastern Christianity. History's so complicated. But at any rate, so Vladimir in political terms, he's fighting the Bulgars, and then 3 years later, he converts to Christianity. Is it really just the service, or does it have something to do with politics? And so here, there's these historic, I have here the siege of Kherson, and then the marriage to Anna. Okay, so what's that all about? Kherson is a place, is a very ancient town down on the Crimean Peninsula. Here is a picture of it down on Crimea, this ancient site, and it's mostly an archaeological site, except that they've rebuilt a church here to honor this important historic place where Vladimir, according to the Chronicle, was converted. So here's the Black Sea, here's the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed in 2014. Why is the Crimea so significant to Russia? One of the reasons that Putin said has exactly to do with this. This is the place where the Russian nation took on Christianity, is one of the reasons. So it was an ancient Greek colony with links to Western civilization and the site of the original baptism of this Slavic prince, according to the Chronicle. So now, there's another political story here, and later in the Chronicle, it does touch on this story, and that is that, so the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, are facing advancing Muslim armies. They will fight them off for centuries in various waves, but the Ottomans will conquer Byzantium in 1453. So it's not just those armies to the east, but also armies in the north from Eastern Europe. The Byzantine emperor, who's also the head of the Byzantine church in this theocratic world at the time, he's looking for allies. And so here's these Vikings are really good fighters, and he'd like to be allies with them. And so he even seems to offer up his daughter Anna to be married to Prince Vladimir. Now for Vladimir, he's like, whoa, Byzantine, even I know that's a big deal. I'm this rough-hewed backward Viking trying to build a city in Kiev, but Byzantine, that's where it's at. That is a real jewel of civilization. And if I can marry his daughter, boy, does that do wonderful things for my prestige. Sign me up. But then Anna doesn't want to go, and the emperor seems to drag his feet. And so historians tell us that maybe that's why Vladimir he sieges Kherson. He's like, here, you said I could marry her. Where is she? And so he sieges Kherson. And the siege isn't given up, maybe, until the emperor agrees to actually send Anna and have him married with Christianity. Supposedly, he has to give up his harem, has many people in it. We're not sure that happened, although he is sainted by the Orthodox Church anyway. But so Anna has to go. She marries Vladimir, and we have the first Christian regime. So, but basically, all this politics is it just goes to say that maybe we shouldn't take the chronicle at face value when they were just so inspired by the music in the service and the light in the church. Because and then in 988, here's another. So just a year afterwards, we have Varangian armies helping Emperor Basil in some of his own military engagements. So some alliance-like cooperation starts to happen quite quickly after his conversion to Christianity. And so this is how Russia steps onto the stage in terms of as a Christian place. 988, he's converted. Now I have these dates. I'm just going to sort of give this as a preview, not to scare you. Our course, we're going to march through some of this history more closely, and you'll get a sense that we're down in Kiev. But in 1354, Moscow is going to become the seat of the Metropolitan. Then in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottomans. And that had been the patriarch, kind of the sacred highest place of Orthodox leadership. And so now it's, well, is it Kiev? Is it going to be Moscow? There's going to be a lot of tension and competition. We'll kind of talk about those things. And then it's in 1472 that Ivan III is going to marry Sophia Paleologia, who is related to the Byzantine emperor, has been living in Rome. And all this, and one of the kind of questions that I want to put on your radar screen are, what are the consequences for Russia's intellectual and cultural heritage that it chooses Orthodoxy instead of Latin Christendom or something else? Now, not to scare you, I have these two other slides. We'll talk about these in more detail. There's more to the story here, and there's some competition between Kiev and Moscow that even a decade ago I didn't think was such a big deal, but contemporary politics in Russia have brought to the fore again that it is a big deal. I'll kind of read through some of these events, and so you hear about it once, and we'll go through all this in more detail. But so 988, conversion. 1147, by the way, when Vladimir converts to Christianity, Moscow isn't a twinkle in anyone's eye. Doesn't even, maybe it's a village. The first time it's ever mentioned in a source as a place, and a pretty small village, is 1147. What is a bigger city is Vladimir. Vladimir is a place west of Russia, east of Moscow. I think I have a map up here in this map. So if you'll notice, or I guess just the thing to notice about this map of Kiev and Rus in the 11th century is that Moscow isn't even on it. It's not even on the map when all this history is happening. There is a reason I'm belaboring this point a little bit. So Moscow doesn't even exist, but in 1299, the Metropolitan, so Constantinople is the patriarchate, and then the kind of next level down level of organization, sort of between like state and county, town, that sort of thing. So patriarchate, then you have Kiev is established as a metropolitanate, and it's headed by a metropolitan. Or if you'll recall, maybe from your Western Civ, the Latin church, one thing that does differently is you have one pope at the top, and then it's a real top-down, more hierarchical organization. Orthodoxy doesn't have doesn't have one pope. That patriarchate is kind of with a patriarch at the top is the biggest, is the highest leadership form. And then as other patriarchates get formed, they're sort of equals. Constantinople is for a long time a first among equals, sort of, but then once it's conquered, that goes out the window a little bit. All right, at any rate, so Kiev takes some hits, as everyone does, from the Mongols. We'll talk about that. And then in 1299, Kiev, which isn't nearly the leading city that it used to be, it will move the metropolitan from Kiev up to Vladimir. And then over time, Moscow kind of becomes this bigger, more important city, and the metropolitan stops living in Vladimir and starts living in Moscow. And he starts living there a long time before it's even made official. Then 1453, Constantinople is going to fall to the Ottomans. Ivan III is going to, a couple decades after that, brings a bride from the west. So he doesn't marry an Orthodox bride, although she needs, well, forgive me, she needs to convert to Orthodoxy for that marriage to happen. Then in the middle of the 16th century, the Union of Lublin creates the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which, oh gosh, this is a really complicated story. They create the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and this is the 16th century. This is the Reformation. And Moscow has been getting to be a bigger state. And some of those states that are getting crushed, they want to stand up against Moscow. And they say, oh, if we had allies from the West that were Christian too, that could do it. And so they formed this thing called the Uniate Church. We'll talk more about this, but basically it's like all our people are Orthodox, but we'll just tell them, you just keep being Orthodox, except the Pope is your leader. And then you shouldn't be taking your cues from Moscow, those imperialist aggressors, and that'll work. Now, when that happens, Moscow kind of, I'm simplifying a little bit, but retaliates and said, hey, we're so important, we're gonna become a patriarchate, not just a metropolitanite. We're super important and you should appreciate it. You should look to us for your religious leadership. And Constantinople isn't totally on board, but they hold their emissary hostage so that he's kind of made an offer he can't refuse, and he pretty much he's like pretty much held hostage there in Moscow, and he's like, okay, you can be a patriarchate, and then they let him go home. And then it's after that sorry, I get the order a little wrong. The political union comes first, and then Moscow's raised to a patriarchate, and then it's after that the eastern edges of Latin Christendom meeting up against the Western expanding Russia say, okay, we're going to form this thing called the Uniate Church, or the Greek Catholic Church. And it really, to me, it's one of the more cynical moves in history, where this new religion is formed with a real, like, the political motivations, I think, are clear and irrefutable. We'll talk more about that. But all this time, Kiev has never actually admitted and said, okay, Moscow's religious authority is greater than ours and we're subordinate to Moscow. I mean, there's major tensions. Putin would just say they've just always been friends. You have a Muscovite army sacking Kiev in 1482, also in the 12th century. There's a more complicated history here than the Russian kind of state message would let on. And it's not until 1687 that the Kievan Metropolitanate actually subordinates to Moscow. Okay, so at this point you might be saying, whoa, why has she just told us all that stuff? I just told you all that stuff, and I'll tell you all that stuff again, but I just told you all that stuff to try and help give you some of the historical context to have a better understanding of why in 2016, right outside the walls of the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin had installed this huge statue of Vladimir the First, this Varangian descended Rurikind who converted to Christianity in 988. And this mix has been brewing quite a bit. And Russia, as part of a Russian national identity, Orthodoxy has been an explicit and central part of it since the 1830s, when Nicholas I's minister Uvarov said the slogan, orthodoxy, nationality, autocracy. This is the slogan of Russia. And so that the history of orthodoxy is our history. But the history of orthodoxy took place on territory that's now Ukraine, and something that Ukrainians feel that Russians don't sufficiently acknowledge and appreciate. And so this kind of little timeline goes through some of these moments and tensions. In 1988, Gorbachev, he allowed the public celebration of 1,000 years of Russian Christianity. And because why is that? Why do you need that to be allowed? You needed that to be allowed because the Soviet Union was an atheist state. That was a real ambitious call for for an empire that was so steeped in religion, and that from the early 19th century had made it kind of part of its mission statement to then turn and say, whoa, we're totally atheist. So the Soviet Union is an atheist endeavor. No, religion is maybe a little allowed, but it's downplayed. And then Mikhail Gorbachev in 1988 celebrates 1,000 years of Russian Christianity. Now I better appreciate, I once, one of the biggest adventures in my life, I went to the Palmyra Lies and I looked at this big peak some Russian mountaineers had climbed called 1,000 Years of Russian Christianity. I thought it was kind of a clunky name for a mountain, but there it is, 1,000 years of Russian Christianity. And they climbed it first in 1988. 1992, the Ukrainian church requests autocephaly from the Muscovite patriarchy, right? So during the Soviet Union, Ukraine can't do much in the way of rallying for its independence. In 1917, 1918, Ukraine very much rallied for its own independence. And there's a whole 19th century history there that's pretty complicated. But in the 1870s, the Russian government issued a statement saying there's no such thing as Ukrainian language, right? That, to just give you one clue into that history. But since the 1680s, right, since 1687, the Kievan Metropolitanate has been subordinate to Moscow. And then in 1992, Soviet Union has ended. Ukraine is establishing itself as an own nation. And so the Ukrainian church goes to, it asks the Muscovite patriots, say, hey, we want to be our own thing. We don't want to be subordinate to you. No more empire. Moscow refuses. And so some other politics ensue. But then we have in 2016, Putin unveils this, actually it's I think 71 foot, not 17 foot statue of Saint Vladimir in Moscow. In 2018, the Ukrainian Orthodox churches actually reunify. So what does that mean? Since this 1595-96 creation of the Greek Catholic or Uniate Church, there's been Orthodoxy, and then there's been Greek Catholic in Ukraine. But it's only been in recent years in Ukraine, there's this sense of let's unite, that maybe this sense, we are a state under siege, let us unite religiously, and that may be good for us. I think I'm not doing justice to all of the nuances of these arguments, I forgive you, but if you've never heard of this stuff, it's pretty complicated. And so I'm starting out at a simplified level. Apologies to anyone who would want a more nuanced account. But at any rate, so in 2018, the Ukrainian Orthodox churches reunify. The Patriarch in Constantinople promises autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, right? So that unification says, oh, we're a bigger body, we deserve a higher standing. And then in 2018, we have a Moscow-Constantinople schism over this act. Like pretty much Moscow says, if you grant that church equal status to us, we are done with you. And so, yeah, this schism happens. We haven't seen a schism like this in centuries. In January 2019, the Patriarch in Constantinople grants autocephaly to the Ukrainian Catholic Church. So there you have it, folks. I know I've gone in super kind of rough terms, but this ancient history from over 1,000 years ago is right now has some level of traction among the political leaders in Russia, in Ukraine. And so now you know you have a little bit more background context about it. Rest assured, if you're a little bit like, what, Uniate Church, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, what are you talking about? As we go through the course, we're gonna talk about all that in a little bit more detail. Okay, with that, I'm gonna wrap up. I'm gonna stop recording.